Ding, 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 ding. We're back in the prayer line where we have to get the bell out again. Okay, Lord, I thank you for tonight as we read your precious book of Esther, Lord, that you put it right in there for us. And Lord, it is for such a time as this. And Lord, we thank you for your word. We thank you for what we learn of your word and how we can apply it to our lives, Lord. And Lord, I thank you for who you are. I thank you for who you are, Lord. And I ask that this lesson blesses everyone who hears it. And I thank you. All right. Last month, we started the book of Esther. We did the first 5 chapters. I'm going to do a very quick review. Chapter 1 starts with a king's banquet that lasted 187 days, and it ends with a queen being deposed, Queen Vashti. She doesn't come to the king's beck and call, and so he removes her. And what we also learn in chapter 1, that this whole banquet's really as a campaign for the king to earn some support for his mounting campaign against the nation of Greece. And so chapter 1, the king, we learn who the king is. Chapter 2, the king comes back from his disastrous military campaign, and he needs a bit of a diversion because he doesn't have a queen anymore. And so an idea comes up. They say, why don't we search for a queen? And poof, they do. Esther becomes queen. So now Esther is the second person in place. Also in chapter 2, Mordecai, at the right place at the right time, hears about an assassination attempt, which, by the way, it's a foreshadowing of what actually does happen to Xerxes. In the year 465, he is assassinated by a couple of the people who were supposed to protect him. And so Mordecai is now in place. In chapter 3, a plot to destroy all the Jews is birthed by a man by the name of Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the enemy of the Jews. And he's also elevated to a top position with the king, with the king's consent. So now we have Haman in place. So we got the major players. Kind of think of it as a giant chessboard where you have the major pieces put in place. And so we've got your antagonist, which is Haman. You've got your protagonist, Mordecai and Esther. And you got the king who, we don't know which way the wind's going to blow yet with him. So chapter 4, the plot is exposed. Mordecai appeals to Esther to reveal her background, which is Jewish, and to go before the king and plead for her people. She says, look, I can't do that. It's illegal for me just to go to the king without him summoning me. And he shoots back a message saying, look, don't think that you're just going to get away just because you're in the palace. Because if you don't do anything, trust me, your family's going to disappear. And here's your chance to do something. But who knows? Maybe you've come to your royal position for such a time as this. Well, what does Esther say? Mordecai, I see your point. This is what you're going to do. Gather all the Jews in Susa, get them together and fast day and night for 3 days. Me and my maids, we're going to do the same thing. And after that 3rd day, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to go to the king, even though it's against the law. I'm going to go to the king and ask. But if I perish, I perish. So she's willing to do what? Defy the law at the time. Because remember, you could not go before the king without being summoned. For him to do so, he actually has to extend his gold scepter. But what do we see in chapter 5? In chapter 5, Esther does go before the king, finds favor. He extends the gold scepter, and she's able to ask both the king and this vile Haman to a banquet that she has prepared. Well, the first night of the banquet, they do, and you think that she's going to tell him exactly what she really wants from him, but she doesn't. She can't do it. Something's not in place yet. So she holds off and says, how about you come the next night to the banquet that I've prepared? And so that's what happens. Well, Haman leaves from the banquet all nice and happy because, Esther invited me and only me and the king, blah, blah, blah. Then he sees Mordecai. What happens? He gets enraged and he decides it isn't enough to destroy the Jews. He wants to go after Mordecai first. And so he goes home, cries to his wife and friends. His wife, Zeresh, says, hey, why don't you just build a pole 75 feet tall, hang him on it, just get permission. Hey, that sounds like a great idea. He does it, he builds it, and that's how chapter 5 ends. Now for the exciting conclusion for such a time as this. We go to chapter 6, verse 1 to 3. That night, the king had trouble sleeping, so he ordered an attendant to bring the book of the history of his reign so he could be read to him. In those records, he discovered the account of how Mordecai had exposed the plot of Bigthana and Teresh, two of the eunuchs who guarded the door to the king's private quarters. They had plotted to assassinate King Xerxes. What reward or recognition did we give Mordecai for this? And of course, the attendant looks in all the paper and goes, well, apparently nothing. Nothing has been done for him. Now, of all the nights that this king could have found 20 different diversions, it just happens that he wants a book of his records read. Now, we read in Malachi 3:16 that God keeps a book of remembrance. Then those who fear the Lord spoke to one another, and the Lord listened and heard them. So a book of remembrance was written before him for those who fear the Lord and who meditate on his name. So when we speak of the Lord has got a book of remembrance. And so we carry on in verse 4 to 5. Who is that in the outer court? The king inquired. As it happened, here we go, coincidence, as we say, or is God working undercover? Haman had just arrived in the outer court of the palace to ask the king to impale Mordecai on the pole that he had prepared. Now remember, even though he might be close to the king, but he still is required to have permission to go from the outer court into the inner court. So the attendants replied to the king, Haman is out in the court. Bring him in, the king ordered. So God's lining everything up. King can't sleep. Let's read Book of Remembrance. Hey, this guy saved my life. We haven't done anything about this, because in that culture, this was a very big deal. You repaid people a kindness and such as that. And so the king, of course, wants to reward him. So we read in 6:9. So Haman came in, and the king said, just to be a fly on the wall to hear this, what should I do to honor a man who truly pleases me? And Haman thought to himself, whom would the king wish to honor more than me? This guy's got such a puffed up view of himself that he thinks that, of course, the king wants to honor him. Well, we read something in Proverbs 16:5. The Lord detests all the proud of heart. Be sure of this, they will not go unpunished. So this is like setting him up. He doesn't even know it. And we continue on in verse 7. So he replied, this is Haman, if the king wishes to honor someone, he should bring out one of the king's own royal robes, as well as a horse that the king himself has ridden, one with a royal emblem on its head. Let the robes and the horse be handed over to one of the king's most noble officials, which makes you wonder who could be more noble than Haman. So who does he have in mind, other than himself apparently, but who knows? And let him see that the man whom the king wishes to honor is dressed in the king's robes and led through the city square on the king's horse. Have the officials shout as they go, this is what the king does for someone he wishes to honor. Now, like I said, this guy has got such a puffed up view of himself. He thinks he's the one who's going to be honored. But what's interesting about him mentioning the royal robe and such, this is not an uncommon thing, because there is a significance attached to a king's garments. A royal minister wearing king's robe was a sign of a unique power, unique favor. We can see this in Genesis 41:42, when Pharaoh gave Joseph. 1 Samuel 18:4, Jonathan given David the robe. So it's representing a sharing of his power or his sanctity. And I gave you some more scriptures in 2 Kings 2:13, 14, Isaiah 61:3 and 10, Zechariah 3, and Mark 5:27. Now, according to the Greek historian Plutarch, wearing clothing belonging to a king was tantamount to asking for the kingship. So makes you wonder what Haman's ulterior motive might be. And we know that he has many ulterior motives. It's not very good motives that he has. No. It's he was probably the one who probably planned the first assassination attempt. And now in verse 10-11. Excellent, the king said to Haman. Quick, take the robes and my horse and do just as you have said for Mordecai the Jew, who sits at the gate of the palace. Leave out nothing you have suggested. Could you imagine the look on Haman's face when he realizes that it's Mordecai, the guy he's come to get permission to hang, to impale, but it's the king that wants to honor him. So Haman took the robes and put them on Mordecai, placed him on the king's own horse, and led him through the city square, shouting, "This is what the king does for someone he wishes to honor." We learn in Matthew 23:12 that those who think themselves great shall be disappointed and humbled, and those who humble themselves shall be exalted. All Haman needed to do is humble himself, but he's so focused on exalting himself. So he thinks he's going to be honored. He isn't. So Mordecai goes from wearing those sackcloth and ashes, mourning on what this decree has done, to now wearing king's clothing and wearing, not only wearing, but riding on the king's horse in public. So this had to be just a complete humiliation to Haman. In verse 12-14, then Mordecai returned to the king's gate, but Haman fled to his house, thoroughly mortified, hiding his face. He's covered in shame. When Haman had finished telling his wife Zeresh and all his friends everything that had happened to him, his knowledgeable friends who were there and his wife Zeresh said, "If Mordecai is in fact a Jew, your bad luck has only begun." In other words, you're screwed. You don't stand a chance against him. You're just as good as ruined. While they were still talking, the king's eunuchs arrived and hurried Haman off to the dinner that Esther had prepared. Remember, this is the banquet number 2. Things have been put in place now. It's getting exciting. So he's dealing with this death blow. He's dealing with the humiliation. And now he still thinks he's pretty much in the king's favor because he's still going to this banquet, hopefully thinking that maybe I can get this humiliation off of me. So in chapter 7, verse 1-3, so the king and Haman went to Queen Esther's banquet, and as they were drinking wine on the second day, the king asked, "Queen Esther, what is your petition? It will be given to you. What is your request? Even up to half of the kingdom, it will be granted." Then Queen Esther answered, "If I have found favor with you, your majesty, and if it pleases you, grant me my life. This is my petition. And spare my people. This is my request." She does this beautifully. And it's just, this is why I probably love the stories, how the wisdom and the tactfulness that she uses here. But you also have to realize what she doesn't say. In verse 4-5, "For I and my people have been sold to be destroyed, killed, and annihilated. If we had been merely sold as male and female slaves, I would have kept quiet, because no such distress would justify disturbing the king, not just over losing slaves, being sold as slaves." King Xerxes asked Queen Esther, "Who is he? Where is he, the man who has dared to do such a thing?" Now, she's so good at this. You have to wonder if something's not niggling in the back of his mind saying, I wonder if this had to do with me. Because remember, when he allowed Haman to do the decree, he didn't know which people they were even talking about. He just said, do whatever you want. So he has no idea. I wonder if this is starting to come back to the forefront of his mind. So kind of like in the book of Daniel, chapter 6, when the King Darius is fooled, okay? So she displays perfect knowledge of knowing what the sum was to for the destruction. She knows the decree very well because, of course, Mordecai has told her. But notice that what she doesn't do is place the blame on who? On the king. She's very clever about it. In verse 6 to 8, Esther replied, "This wicked Haman is our adversary and our enemy." Haman grew pale with fright before the king and queen. Then the king jumped up to his feet in a rage and went out to the palace garden. Haman, however, stayed behind to plead for his life with Queen Esther, for he knew that the king intended to kill him. Now, something about this culture that has to be understood, okay? You could not be within 7 paces of the king's harem, his queen, his concubines. You couldn't be alone. Unless you're a eunuch, that was something different. But Haman should have gotten up and gone with the king. But, of course, he already thinks he's dead, so this is where he's going to try to beg for mercy. The very mercy that he apparently didn't want to show anyone else. He's going to try it here. In despair, he fell on the couch. How convenient. Where Queen Esther was reclining, just as the king was returning from the palace garden. Okay, now he's up right there, probably putting his hand around her to try to beg for mercy. The king exclaimed, "Will he even assault the queen right here in the palace before my very eyes?" And as soon as the king spoke, the attendants covered Haman's face, signaling his doom. So even Haman, so mortified, so just terrified that he doesn't even try to say, well, king, you allowed me to do this. So it's amazing that, Esther doesn't, implicate the king, and neither does Haman. Haman he's too terrified. What we learn out of this is Proverbs 26:27. The man who sets a trap for others will get caught in it himself. Roll a boulder down on someone, it will roll back and crush you. Just look at all the Looney Tunes with Wile E. Coyote. Every time he tries to get the Roadrunner, it just rolls back on him. I like how the Message reads that very verse. Malice backfires, spite boomerangs. So Haman, in his puffed up, exalted view of himself, never imagines that Esther is a Jew. He had no idea that she's actually the most dreaded opponent in this major game of chess, that he takes his eye off the queen, thinking that she's just a non-player, just a woman. But what happens? Everything just falls right into place for the Lord and just crumbles for him. So, chapter 7, verse 9 and 10. Then Harbona, one of the king's eunuchs, said, Haman has set up a sharpened pole that stands 75 feet tall in his own courtyard. He intended to use it to impale Mordecai, the man who saved the king from assassination. Then impale Haman on it, the king ordered. So they impaled Haman on the pole, and he had set up for Mordecai, and the king's anger subsided, which basically relieved the king because, hey, I was the one who gave him permission to do this, but hey, now we got rid of him. And Esther still doesn't, implicate him, which is very tactful, by the way. But so we started the story of Queen Esther with a queen being deposed. Now we have Haman being deposed. So things are going in the reverse order. Everything that had been set up, especially to destroy the Jews, things are starting to reverse. In chapter 8, verse 1 to 2. On the same day, King Xerxes gave the property of Haman, the enemies of the Jew, to Queen Esther. Then Mordecai was brought before the king, for Esther had told the king how they were related. The king took off his signet ring, which he had taken back from Haman, and gave it to Mordecai. And Esther appointed Mordecai to be in charge of Haman's property. Now, if Haman had gone his way, he would have taken property. Now it's the reverse. So now he doesn't even have anything to pass on to his family because all the property is taken. So the reversal of fortunes are pretty much close to complete here. Verse 3 to 6. Esther again pleaded with the king, falling at his feet and weeping. She begged him to put an end to the evil plan of Haman, the Agagite, which he had devised against the Jews. Then the king extended the gold scepter to Esther. She still has that much favor with him. And rose and stood before him. If it pleases the king, she said, and if you regard me with favor and thinks it's the right thing to do, and if he is pleased with me, let an order be written overruling the dispatches that Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, devised and wrote to destroy the Jews in all the king's provinces. For how can I bear to see such disaster fall on my people? How can I bear to see the destruction of my family? In verse 7 to 8, then King Xerxes said to Queen Esther. Now remember, Haman's out of the picture, but the decree still stands. They have to try to figure something out here. Then King Xerxes said to Queen Esther and Mordecai, I have given Esther the property of Haman, and he has been impaled on a pole because he tried to destroy the Jews. Now go ahead and send a message to the Jews in the king's name, telling them whatever you want, and seal it with the king's signet ring. But remember, whatever has already been written in the king's name and sealed with his signet ring cannot be revoked. This was the same thing that happened in Daniel 6. Remember when they set up that fake thing that you got to bow before, no, like Daniel could not bow before another god or any. They had to do it before the king. Of course, they set him up with it, and they set the king up too. Which is the part that I gotta tell you, all these times that I've read this story is like, you're king and you can't reverse it. That's always bothered me. Why? You're king. So you should be able to reverse things like that. But that was the law, that is the Persian law, and that's what they did. So the decree still stands. Now they have to come up with a loophole, but they do find a loophole, and here it is. At once, the royal secretaries were summoned on the 23rd day of the third month, the month of Sivan, which would put it about 25 June, 474 BC. They wrote out all of Mordecai's orders to the Jews and to the satraps, governors, and the nobles of the 127 provinces stretching from India to Cush. These orders were written in the script of each province, in the language of each people, and also to the Jews in their own script and language. Mordecai wrote in the name of King Xerxes, sealed the dispatches with the king's signet ring, and sent them out by mounted couriers, who rode fast horses, especially bred for the king. These are special horses. The king's edict granted that the Jews in every city the right to assemble and protect themselves. That was not in the first edict that went out. This is the loophole they get. They can defend themselves to destroy, to kill, and annihilate the armed men of any nationality or province who might attack them and their women and children and plunder their property of their enemies. So they actually have the right to muster an army to get whatever weapons they need to protect themselves. The day appointed for the Jews to do this in all the provinces of the king Xerxes was the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar, which is what we are in right now, the month of Adar. And because this is a Jewish leap year, we're in Adar 2. There are 2 Adars because we're in a Jewish leap year. And Saturday night is when Purim begins. Tomorrow night is when the fast of Esther starts. So a copy of the text of the edict was to be issued as law in every province and made known to the people of every nationality so that the Jews would be ready on that day to avenge themselves on their enemies. The couriers, riding the royal horses, went out, spurred on by the king's command, and the edict was issued in the citadel of Susa. And if you notice in your little packet that I gave you, the dates for the Adar 2, because a Jewish leap year happens every 2 to 3 years. It happens 7 times in a 19-year cycle. So, verse 15, 17. When Mordecai left the king's presence, he was wearing royal garments of blue and white, and a large crown of gold, and purple robe of fine linen. Now, if you remember in the first chapter when they talked about all of how everything was decorated with gold, blues, and the purples, it's Mordecai who is decked out in the same thing. So you can see the similarities between chapter 1 and getting toward the end here. For the Jews, it was a time of happiness and joy, gladness and honor. In every province and every city to which the edict of the king came, there was joy and gladness among the Jews, with feasting and celebration. And many people of other nationalities became Jews because the fear of the Jews has seized them. Remember, they're celebrating before the day is even going to happen, because there was enough time in there for them to get the edict out to everything and to prepare themselves. They went from being in sackcloth and ashes and mourning to now they're doing what? They're celebrating right now, because there's a loophole in the law. A decree has been written that they themselves can now defend themselves and attack those who are trying to attack them. So chapter 9, this is the longest chapter, by the way. Verse 1 to 4. On the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar, the edict commanded by the king was to be carried out. On this day, the enemies of the Jews had hoped to overpower them, but now the tables were turned and the Jews got the upper hand over those who hated them. The Jews assembled in their cities in all the provinces of King Xerxes to attack those determined to destroy them. No one can stand against them, because the people of the other nationalities were afraid of them. And all the nobles of the provinces, the satraps, the governors, and the king's administrators helped the Jews, because fear of Mordecai had seized them. Now remember, they were going for it when Haman was the one issuing the edict. Now it's reversed. It's now going in the Jews' favor. Mordecai was prominent in the palace. His reputation spread throughout the provinces, and he became more and more powerful. Reminds you of Joseph. He was second in the land to Pharaoh. This is just a very similar story. Verse 5 to 10. The Jews struck down all their enemies with the sword, killing and destroying them. They did what they pleased to those who hated them. In the citadel of Susa, the Jews killed and destroyed 500 men. Okay, I'm going to try to get through these 10 names, okay? In a Jewish custom, apparently, if you can say this in one breath, you're doing pretty well, but I'm not going to be able to do that. They also killed Pashadatha, Dalphon, Aspatha, Porthatha, Adila, Eridatha, Parmashta, Eridai, and Vajathatha, the 10 sons of Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the enemy of the Jews. They did not lay their hands on the plunder. That's number one. That's all right. Now, like I said, in Jewish custom, when they read this in the synagogue on the day of Purim, you have to try to read that whole thing in one breath. I did it in 2 or 3, but whatever. Verse 11, 13. The number of those killed in the citadel of Susa was reported to the king that same day. The king said to Queen Esther, "The Jews have killed and destroyed 500 men and the 10 sons of Haman in the citadel of Susa. What have they done in the rest of the king's provinces? Now what is your petition? It will be given to you. What is your request? It will also be granted." "If it pleases the king," Esther answered, "give the Jews in Susa permission to carry out this day's edict tomorrow also, and let Haman's 10 sons be impaled on poles." Verse 14, 15. So the king agreed, and the decree was announced in Susa, and they impaled the bodies of Haman's 10 sons. You're probably saying, now, wait a minute, they're already dead. This is to send a message A very strong message. And boy, I mean, I think this is probably why Martin Luther probably didn't like it, because it was too bloodthirsty and whatever. But hey, back in those days, you had to send a message, and this was one way to do it. Then the Jews at Susa gathered together on March 8th, which is the 14th of Adar, and killed 300 more men. And again, they took no plunder. That's the second time you hear that. Verse 16, 19. Meanwhile, the remainder of the Jews who were in the king's provinces also assembled to protect themselves and get relief from their enemies. They killed 75,000 of them, but did not lay hands on the plunder. That's the third time. This happened on the 13th day, the month of Adar, and on the 14th they rested and made a day of feasting and joy. The Jews in Susa, however, had assembled on the 13th and 14th, and then on the 15th they rested and made it a day of feasting and joy. That is why rural Jews, those living in villages, observe the 14th of the month of Adar as the day of joy and feasting, a day for giving presents to each other. It's still celebrated to this day. Verse 20 to 23. Mordecai recorded these events and sent letters to the Jews near and far throughout all the provinces of King Xerxes, calling on them to celebrate an annual festival of these 2 days. He told them to celebrate these days of feasting and gladness by giving gifts of food to each other and presents to the poor. This would commemorate a time when the Jews gained relief from their enemies, when their sorrow was turned into gladness and their mourning into joy. So the Jews accepted Mordecai's proposal and adopted this annual custom. Now notice, this is man-ordained custom. There are 7 feasts that God has ordained. Purim and Hanukkah are 2 of the man-made ones, the man-ordained ones. And so verse 24 to 28. Haman, the son of Hammedatha the Agagite, the enemy of the Jews, had plotted to crush and destroy them on the date determined by casting lots. The lots were called the Pur, or Purim. But when Esther came before the king, he issued a decree causing Haman's evil plot to backfire, and Haman and his sons were impaled on a sharpened pole. That is why this celebration is called Purim, because it is an ancient word for casting lots. So because of Mordecai's letter and because of what they had experienced, the Jews throughout the realm agreed to inaugurate this tradition and pass it on to their descendants and to all who became Jews. They declared that they would never fail to celebrate these 2 prescribed days at the appointed time each year. These days would be remembered and kept from generation to generation and celebrated by every family throughout the provinces, the cities of the empire. This festival of Purim would never cease to be celebrated among the Jews, nor would the memory of what happened ever die out among their descendants. And it still goes on to this day. Verse 29 to 32 in the Message. Queen Esther, the daughter of Abihail, backed by Mordecai the Jew, using her full queenly authority in the second Purim letter to endorse and ratify what he wrote. Calming and reassuring letters went out to all the Jews throughout the 127 provinces of Xerxes' kingdom to fix these days of Purim, their assigned place on the calendar, dates set by Mordecai the Jew, and what they agreed to for themselves and their descendants regarding their feasting, fasting, and mourning. Esther's word was confirmed that the tradition of Purim was written in the book. So this story of Esther explains where Purim came from. And of course, these were the Jews who, many of them stayed in Susa, stayed in the Persian Empire. Many of them did go back to rebuild Israel. Chapter 10, a very short chapter. King Xerxes imposed a tribute throughout his empire, even to the distant coastlands. His great achievements and the full account of the greatness of Mordecai, whom the king had promoted, are recorded in the book of the history of the kings of Media and Persia. Mordecai the Jew became the prime minister, with authority next to that of King Xerxes himself. He was very great among the Jews, who held him in high esteem, because he continued to work for the good of his people and to speak up for the welfare of all their descendants. And this is why it's still celebrated today. This weekend it will be celebrated. Now, in some regards, like more Orthodox, they tend to keep it a little calmer. In places like Tel Aviv, it's kind of like a Halloween celebration is what it's turned into. People dress up, and some of the more calmer places, the kids dress up. The little girls dress up like Queen Esther. Some of the boys will dress up like Mordecai. Some will dress up like Haman, because you got to have a bad guy in there. And so, and it still happens to this day. Now, we're going to read a little more about this. What kind of foods are eaten on Purim? Okay, the sending of portions are gifts of food, treats, and goodies that Jewish communities send to friends and family on Purim. It is traditional to have a jovial feast, or Sedat Purim. In the evening of the holiday, drinking alcohol is part of the Purim holiday celebration. This is probably why Martin Luther didn't really like this story, because it celebrated drinking, debauchery. In fact, the requirement in the Talmud goes as far to instruct that one should get so drunk that they can't tell the difference between the phrases of Ahur Haman, cursed is Haman, and Baruch Mordecai, blessed is Mordecai. And believe me, if it comes to saying get drunk, people will take that quite. Oh, yeah. Boy, do something wrong, they're all for it. Traditional foods include Hanzai Haman, or ears of Haman, or Hamastashon, which sounds more German than Jewish, a triangular cookie usually filled with different flavors of jam or poppy seed filling known as mon, which is supposed to represent either Haman's ears or his three-cornered hat, which we don't know where that really came from. Another triangular-shaped food that is customary to eat is kreplach, which is small dumplings usually filled with meat, mashed potatoes, or other fillings. Other traditional foods or dishes are made with beans, a reminder of what Esther ate in the king's palace in order to avoid eating non-kosher food. Because of this, Esther bean tradition is usually celebrated as a vegetarian meal. Now, we have, for the next several years, from 2024 to 2030 is the next Purim dates I put in there for you. And then I put in some pictures of what happens usually in Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, and they really celebrate. It's a really big deal to this day, where, like I said, the little girls will dress up as little queens, and adults dress up very much, and they get quite a bit carried away with it. What exactly, you can tell, and like I said in the first, in part one, when we discussed last month, that Martin Luther hated this particular book. He did not want it in. He did not want it kept in the Bible. He hated it because it just dealt with too much paganism and all this stuff. So, and that's probably part of the reason why he doesn't like it. But this is a tradition that goes on. I love the story myself because of the reversal. Everything looked like it's going bad, looks like it's a disaster, and what happens? God turns it around. But we don't see God's name in this, but we all know that God's operating in this. And that was the other thing that, Martin Luther didn't like, because his name is not mentioned. But you can feel him all over it. His hand is all over it, quite frankly. How he's placing every person, from the bad guys to the good guys, and to the one who's kind of wavering in the middle there. Because the king, you didn't know whether or not he was going to go with Haman or Queen Esther. But what happens? Such favor that Esther had with the king that everything goes in their direction. And which is why I love the story. And I told you one of my favorite movies that they did of the Book of Esther was done in 1999. It's called Esther, and it had F. Mary Abram as Mordecai in it, and Louise Lombard as Queen Esther, and it's done very well. And they try to keep as close to it. Of course, they do a little embellishments in there, but as long as you know the story, you know where they're embellishing on. But it's one of my personal favorites, along with the Book of Ruth. I just love how God just reverses things. And that's what it reminds you of, is that God will reverse things. And the fact that they took the 3 days to fast, even though they didn't say pray, but they took the 3 days to fast. And you know in those 3 days, God just lined everything up. And Esther was willing to go forth at the risk of losing her own life. She did it for the sake of her people. And sometimes you don't know what's going to happen unless you go in there and do it. And she did. And this is why we have the story of Esther, not the story of Matilda. I mean, this is just how it is, okay? So this is why it's perfect. And so that, my friends, is how this ends tonight. Until the next time, on Journey with Jerry, we will go into the book of Judges. And so that should be, that's why we're going to break it down to a couple of months there, because that's a lot. It's a lot to dig into. But so much, every time I read, even when I read Esther, I always notice something different. I just love it. So that, my friends. So anything that anybody would like to add, or? Mm-hmm. Did she? Lightly. They do. They do. Yep. Well, you see it in the book of Joshua. To remember what God has done. That's why the 7 feasts are the God-appointed ones. Yep. Yep. Well, this was like the first planned Holocaust, you can say. But didn't go their way. So, but shalom, shalom. Yep. Blessed going in, blessed going out. So, yep. Anyone else? Well, my friends. The Messiah, yes. When he rode on but kind of like Solomon rode on the donkey, and Jesus rode in on the donkey. But he, oh, he probably was. He had to have been cursing the whole time he had to dress him up. Had to be. But you notice that he was at least loyal enough to the king that he actually did the duty. Begrudging. Oh, yeah. He. That's a nice way of putting it. I mean, if king had stopped too fast, right there. Well, but he didn't realize he was losing his position right there. I mean. Because they sometimes do tend to embellish a little too much. It's like, okay, we get the point. We get the point. But that is it for today, folks. Until next time.